We are purpose-driven, so our purpose is to use our financial expertise to do good for individuals, businesses, and society. Okay, that's our purpose.
Agriculture plays a major role in economic growth and development. However, with the economy finding itself in a position it has never seen before, the sector has been hit drastically. It has now become imperative to not only invest in the agricultural sector, but to fund its transition to a climate-resilient agricultural sector. Welcome to Africa Business Radio. I am Nonso Mordi, and joining me to talk about this is John Hudson, National Head of Agriculture at Nedbank. Welcome, John. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Nonso, welcome to you as well, and welcome to your listeners. It's great to be online.
All right, thank you. Now let's start with this. People talk about the agricultural sector and, there's so much emphasis on it. So I want you to tell us, what makes the sector itself unique?
Well, I think the sector has such a vital role to play, and that might sound obvious, but if I unpack it a bit more, I think from a food security point of view, it has huge importance. Now, whether you're talking about national food security, from a national point of view, or household food security, and those two, while they might sound like the same thing, are not quite the same thing, obviously. You might be food secure as a country, and for example, South Africa, we export more than 50% of what we produce by value. So we are food secure at a national level, but at a household level, you could argue it's not quite the same, and people struggle. And hunger is a real problem, and I think not only in South Africa, but in the rest of Africa as well.
Yeah.
So I think food plays such an important role, firstly from, just securing enough food to feed your family.
Yes.
But more importantly, or not more importantly, that's probably the most important. But thereafter, if you look at the whole value chain, because in South Africa, for example, our primary food production it's less than 3% of our national GDP. So in that context, it's quite a small sector. But as soon as you take into account the value chains and the linkages, and what I mean by linkages is that, there's a whole lot of inputs such as fertilizer and that go to farmers. Farmers produce a crop and then they sell it on to processors. It goes through the whole value chain of processing and then ends up in either retail or being exported. Okay. Now, if you look at that whole value chain, the economic activity that happens along that chain is huge. The multiples are probably 6 or 7 times that primary food production. So I think you're starting to see that it has such an important bearing on a country, not only from a food security point of view, but from an economic activity point of view as well. And there we start to talk about employment, etc. And quite honestly, agriculture is a big employer. It really is. So I think you start to understand that the sector is not just about growing crops. It's so much more than that. And the economic activity along the entire value chain is really important for a country. And, as I've indicated in the case of South Africa, we export more than 50% by value of what we produce. So from export earnings as well, it's a really good foreign exchange earner. So I think there's multiple factors.
Yes, definitely. There is multiple factors. And I like that you also pointed out that agriculture is not just about planting crops, growing them, but there's a whole lot that goes into it. Now, let's look at climate change and the sector now, because that's one of the bases of this interview. How much has climate change, affected the sector? How detrimental is it towards the sector?
Well, I think climate change is such a big topic, and there's a few points to this. We definitely, I don't think there's anyone that denies that climate change is not here. I think for a while, and maybe in the recent past, I'm going back 10 years or so, people were a bit skeptical. Is this climate change real, or is it's just part of a normal cycle? I think more recently with what we've seen in terms of the extreme weather that's happening around the world,
yes,
and in particular in Africa and in South Africa, whether it's floods, heat waves, there's a lot of devastation that is happening from climate change. So I think that's the first thing. No one can argue that climate change is not real. It's very real. The next thing is that the population growth, and this has been bandied about a lot. But in terms of increasing population, we need to feed an increasing population, and we need to do that without putting additional pressure on our natural resources. And so what you really need to do is do more with less, but do it in such a way that does not damage our natural resources. And that's quite a challenge. That's not easy, because you've got two parts to that. We need to do more with less, and that means that we have to be more sustainable, we have to be more efficient, and we have to produce more food without putting our natural resources under pressure. And so I sense that the climate change debate might have lost a little bit of focus in the last month or 2, 3, 4 months. If you look at COVID, if you look at Russia-Ukraine crisis, for example, that's brought a lot of hardship, and the world is such an uncertain place that I think it's maybe taken the spotlight off climate change. But quite honestly, longer term, I think climate change is still our biggest risk factor facing agriculture, and by implication, the impact it could have on food production will then impact on food security. So I think it really could have a devastating impact. What I will say, however, is that through the adoption of technology and even through plant breeding, for example, I think we are managing to deal with some of these challenges that are facing us, and certainly technology helps us do that. So it's not all bad news, because the technology that has now been applied in agriculture, so whether it's energy, whether it's water, whether it's soil health, whether it's just precision farming, I think is certainly helping us do more with less. So that's the good news. The other point is that, and again, I'll talk to South Africa is what I really do understand, is that the adoption by farmers of technology in support of climate smart farming is really taking off. And you might argue that renewable energy is at the moment top of the pops, because we are having quite a bit of load shedding, and we have constraints through our normal energy supply. So quite logically, farmers are looking at how best to in terms of securing their businesses and combating the sort of energy crisis. They then started to look at renewable energy, and that's good for the planet. It's good for their businesses as well. And of course, banks like ourselves at Nedbank, we have such a pivotal role to play in driving this change, and we can drive that change to sustainable farming practices through our lending. And so quite honestly, I think wider society has such a role to play. So whether it's business, whether it's banks, whether it's the farmers, whether it's governments as well, we need a lot of partnerships to come together that will drive us towards a much more climate smart sector.
All right. Now, I agree with you that sustainable farming, has, taken root in not just in South Africa, but the world to as large. And we see farmers adopting it steadily. But I also know that there are some challenges, with one of them being funding. So now, why is it important for investors now to invest in this agricultural sector? Because, what we've said, we want to transition to a climate resilient sector. So why must they bring out the money to ensure that this takes form?
Yeah. So I think, if you look at the investment into the sector, and that could be farmers themselves investing into their own businesses.
Okay.
It could be outside investors that are looking to diversify out of whatever sector they're in into agriculture. It could be banks as well, in terms of their what we call portfolio tilt. So how do you tilt your portfolio towards a certain segment? And from a Nedbank point of view, we took this stance probably 10 years ago, that agriculture and the whole agribusiness value chain was a really important growth sector going forward. And I think that's been proven correct, because what we tend to see in times of crisis, and if we go back to the financial crisis, we go back to COVID, and then more recently the Russia and Ukraine crisis, is that agriculture tends to rise to the top. We've seen positive awareness and positive sentiment towards farmers, towards food production, towards agriculture, and I think that's based on food security. One, if you are a food secure country in times of crisis, and you have a strong agricultural sector, that's a huge strength for a country. It brings stability to your country, because essentially if you can feed your people, you're doing a really good job. I did talk a bit about household security. So the ability to pay for food, it's all very well that the food is available. And in South Africa, we have a very strong commercial farming sector that produce food and then also export food as well. But we also need the local the economy to fire as well in South Africa. We can't pin all of this on agriculture. So I'm saying, yes, invest in agriculture. It is really a fundamental part of any country in terms of stability, in terms of the food security, in terms of employment, in terms of the economic activity. But I'm also saying that you've got to have sufficient economic activity to employ your population, who then have the ability to buy the food that is produced or to produce the food themselves. So that's another nice component of household food security. And if we look at investment in food production, I'm not only talking about commercial food production and big investments by corporates, etc. Even at a household foods level, I think there is investment into your own production of food, which is another way of really dealing with household food security.
So you're saying investing doesn't just have to start and stop with the big guns, but even we ourselves as individuals need to invest when it comes to agriculture, food.
Definitely. I think in particular in an African context where much of our population is still rural, it makes even more sense. You could argue that possibly in a developed world, it doesn't make sense to maybe grow your own vegetables in your garden and so on. The other thing I'm going to point out, and I think it's quite an important component of this conversation, is food waste.
Okay.
Because food waste is also part of the whole sustainability picture, if you want to call it that. So in South Africa, and I think it's no different in terms of studies done by the likes of the WWF, almost a third of our food is wasted. So either at farm gate level or throughout the value chain, or even in the retail, and even at household, we have food that gets thrown away. So food wastage is a big issue. And I think if you can recover that food, so before the food is wasted, it's still nutritious, the quality is still okay. If you can redistribute that to needy communities in terms of food redistribution, that's massive in terms of the alleviation of hunger, for example. But it's also good from a sustainability point of view, because every ton of food that we recover, we save 3 to 4 tons in greenhouse gases. So you can see that the recovery of food is also good for the planet, and it's also good for the population in terms of distributing food to needy families.
Yes, I do agree with you when we come to the issue of food waste, because that's another sector that we are not really looking at. Now, let's look at the role of banks in driving sustainable food production. For example, Nedbank. Now, what does a bank consider when approached for agricultural finance?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and I must say that banks and large banks on the continent and in South Africa, the big banks down here, there's different ways that we can deploy our funding. So some of it goes through our corporate and social investment, our CSI, through our foundation, etc. So some of that is aimed at agriculture as well and the green economy, right? But really, that's quite a small spend. So in our Nedbank context, there's probably 130 million per annum that gets spent on CSI, and that's got to go to health and education and agriculture and infrastructure and all sorts of things. So it's not a big number in the context of Nedbank, where we lend probably north of 200 billion to our clients.
Wow.
Okay. So if you want to, and this is our clients across the board, not only our farmers.
Okay.
I'll just make that clear. But the point I want to make is that if you're wanting to drive change, then use your lending, because our lending is where we lend a lot of money. You know, our CSI spend at 130 million compared to 200 billion is chalk and cheese. So if you want to drive positive change in a society, then do it through your lending. And certainly that's what we have done at Nedbank. We are purpose driven. So our purpose is to use our financial expertise to do good for individuals, businesses, and society. Okay, that's our purpose. But underpinning our purpose is the SDG, so the Sustainable Development Goals. And if you start to unpack that then, and you start to use your lending in how you incorporate that into your Sustainable Development Goals, then you start to drive society, I think, in a positive direction towards a much more sustainable, society in total. And so banks do a lot of lending, but in lending, and I'm with Nedbank Commercial Banking, so
okay.
I don't give money away. You know,
okay.
I'm a typical bank. I want my money back.
Yes.
And I charge people for their money. You know, interest rates on the money. So if you in my game where you want people to pay back the money and you want them to pay a fee for that money, then you've got to ensure that your selection is such that you're looking at repayment ability first and foremost. So we do want to know from our farming clients, for example, that they have the ability to repay the debt, because we don't want to be, the bank that lends too much money, the clients cannot pay it back, and then we have to sell them up, and then that's a complete fall down. So repayment ability and the ability to understand our clients' businesses is critical. And in doing that, I mean, it's not foolproof, because agriculture deals with nature and so on, and we have shocks to the system, including the climate change shocks that we spoke about. But understanding the sector, understanding your client, understanding your responsibility as a bank, and then focusing that in a way that looks at a sustainable development longer term is what we do. So I suppose the short answer to your question is, first and foremost, we look at repayment ability, and clients and ourselves need to work through that and understand it, and that, it needs to be demonstrated that they can repay the money that we lend them.
Exactly. It's really key and critical that before giving the money, you should be sure that the clients can pay, because like you said, the bank doesn't want to fold up all in the name of trying to help, boost the sector. Okay, so let's talk about the partnerships. Yes. One of them being the NBI, that's National Business Initiative, in collaboration with Just Share and the Worldwide Fund for Nature. They're dedicating a project to climate and sustainable investment. Now, partnerships like this, what is your role, in driving awareness about this climate change and the impact, especially in the agricultural sector?
So, just to dive into this a bit further, the WWF in particular has been a long-standing partner of ours, and they've been a partner with Nedbank for 30 years. And so it's been a long-standing partnership, and especially in the early years, the environmental focus was top of mind, and it still is. But I think the partnerships have now become much more focused on a total solution. So it's not only about the environment, which is extremely important, but it's also having a sustainable business within that particular environment, And more recently, in the last 8 years, the partnership with the WWF has focused on agriculture. So we've been really lucky to have them as a partner. I think they're a credible partner, world-renowned, brings so much good information to the table, and we've used that to drive awareness. And then more recently with the likes of the NBI, and we have other partners, specifically in agriculture, we have partnerships with the dairy sector, with the citrus sector, and various sectors to start to showcase where the sustainable farming is happening. It's to give recognition and to create awareness around it, because I think if we do that, and that's been part of our journey with these key partners, is how do you demonstrate that sustainable practices also leads to financial sustainability? So can we link the dots that these practices are also good for business, and if you can start to address the business risk through it, then a businessman sits up and he takes note. Because if you're saying to him, we can also help solve your business risk, he says, okay, now you're talking to my pocket and my bottom line. That's what I understand. Because there are some farmers or businesses out there that, yes, the planet, they want to save the planet, but first and foremost, they want to save their business, they want to make money, and they want to do well for their families and their society. So I think the partnerships are starting to evolve beyond just the awareness, and they're starting to move to where we're actually proving the business case. We're saying that sustainable farming practices is good for business. And now we're seeing the uptake through our products and so on, our lending that I was talking about, is that now we've got products in place for renewable energy, water efficiency, shade netting, soil health, etc. So that's where we're moving to, because it's also a massive opportunity for the banks. And it's good for us as banks to prove to our investors, our shareholders, that this is a good bank to invest in, because we're looking at financial and environmental sustainability for the long term, and that, this is a good bank to invest in. So it's quite a long answer to your partnerships, but we do feel that selective partnerships with key stakeholders is the way that we need to go, because as a bank, we don't pretend to know everything about climate change.
Yes.
We don't pretend to know everything about renewable energy, so we've got to lean on these partners who are either telling a good story, or they're bringing really valuable information to the table. They are looking to equip our farmers and our clients with this information, and then that makes for a much better business case.
Yes, exactly. Now, before I let you go, let's talk about what if now. I would like to say what if, because we've talked about the climate change, its effect on the agricultural sector, and how we need to build a strong fort for the agricultural sector. Now, what happens if we fail to climate-proof the sector? Because I feel it's important that people understand the risk we're in right now if we don't take action. So, in your opinion, what happens if we don't grab the bull by the horns now and start doing what we're meant to do?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I'm not a scientist, so I'm not going to give you any scientific figures. But what I do think is that we've been drifting along, and for a long time, and I did say this when we started out, is that I'm not sure people were convinced about climate change, and it was, well, we won't really worry about it. Maybe we'll leave it to the next generation to sort out. Mm-hmm. But it's crystal clear to me that we have to fix it now. That's how desperate it's almost got. And sometimes I feel that we almost need like a COVID reaction to climate change, because we kind of drift along when it comes to climate change. We need intervention, and we need it now, But I think society is starting to realize that, and we're starting to see the evidence of increased temperatures, extreme droughts, extreme floods, etc. So I think that the penny has dropped, and I certainly, while we know that we are good as a society at adapting to change and bringing on new technology on board, and that's certainly part of the solution. I think we're heading towards a train smash if we don't start to reverse these negative impacts.
Yes.
And then we're going to see much more food insecurity, and that's going to be an issue, because as soon as you have food instability, you have instability throughout your country, and then you start to have potential problems around riots and food riots and so on, and unstable governments and so on. So I think there is a realization that we need to turn this around, and that we're actually running out of time. Now, I haven't given you any facts and figures. I can't say that by 2025, we're going to have massive problems and food shortages. But I really feel that the penny has dropped, and that there's a lot of people that are understanding this better. I'm seeing much more information come through that is supporting the business case around it. So, even if we weren't worried about climate change, a lot of the what we're looking to introduce is just good for business, and so why not do it, and at the same time save the planet. So Yeah, I'm convinced. I think you can hear that. But we need to get everybody on board, because we need governments on board as well, for that matter.
Yes, definitely. Everyone has to be on board, because like you said, and I totally agree, this is something we need to start now and not wait for later till, it becomes as bad as it was during the COVID, that everybody now had to do the whole rush. All right. Thank you so much, John, for coming on the show and for talking to us. I mean, it was really an interesting conversation.
It's a pleasure, Nonso, and thank you for having me.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye. That was John Hudson, National Head of Agriculture at Nedbank. More coming your way. Stay tuned.